It was 1945, and winter refused to release its grip on a dying Europe. Snow drifted over shattered towns and rail yards like a filthy shroud, falling onto the bones of a continent that no longer knew peace. The air reeked of smoke, hunger, and despair. Germany was not ending with a single gunshot. It was bleeding out, slowly, painfully, piece by piece. Cities stood hollow, black skeletons against the white sky. Roads were jammed with refugees dragging themselves westward. Faces gray, hands clutching scraps of bread or nothing at all. And among the broken columns of soldiers and civilians moved another kind of exile. Young women in faded gray-green uniforms, walking out of a war they no longer believed in. One of them was Greta Weber. At 22, she looked older than her years. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was dulled by grime and sleepless nights. Her fingers were cracked and blistered from endless hours at a field telephone. When she had joined the Luftwaffe in 1943, it had been out of naive hope. The recruiter's words still echoed in her mind. Clean work, safe work, far from the front. For a time, it was true. Greta spent her days surrounded by the hum of radios and the scent of ersatz coffee, laughing with other girls about pilots they'd never meet. But as the Reich crumbled and Allied forces closed in, the laughter vanished. Messages grew frantic, coded pleas for reinforcements that would never come, orders shouted by commanders who no longer knew what they commanded. By April 1945, Greta's unit had been relocated near Kassel, a city bombed into ash and rubble. Each night, the horizon burned red. Rumors passed faster than official reports. The Americans are near. The front is gone. Hitler is in Berlin, maybe dead. Greta wrote a final letter to her mother, a letter she knew might never be delivered, and packed what little she had. A scarf, a worn photograph of her father in his Great War uniform, and a crust of bread. She told herself the chaos would pass in a few days. Deep down, she knew it wouldn't. She was one of thousands. Across Germany, 500,000 women wore military uniforms by the war's end. Clerks, typists, radio operators, searchlight crews. They were told they would never fight, yet war cared nothing for such distinctions. As the front collapsed, many were swept into retreating columns, abandoned by their superiors, and left to face the enemy alone. The night the Americans arrived, Greta and the others were ordered to burn everything. Files, codes, reports, years of work turned to smoke. The papers curled and blackened in the stove until the air grew thick and acrid. Sometime before dawn, the officers disappeared. No goodbyes, no instructions, just gone. When morning broke, the sound of Sherman tanks rolled over the hills like distant thunder. Greta stepped into the road with trembling hands raised, her satchel slipping from her shoulder. Around her, other girls did the same, some crying, others frozen in disbelief. The Americans shouted commands in a language they barely understood. A few old clerks tried to speak and were pushed aside, forced to sit in the mud. Greta braced herself for the shot she'd been taught to expect. All her life, she had heard that the enemy, whether Russian, British, or American, would show no mercy. But no bullet came. Instead, a soldier tore the Luftwaffe eagle from her collar and tossed it into the snow. Another inspected her meager bread crust, sniffed, and silently handed it back. There was no cruelty in their faces, only weariness. The women were herded into groups, pointed toward trucks, and loaded like cargo. Greta climbed aboard with numb fingers. The engine roared, shaking her bones. Across from her sat Lotte Adler, a dark-haired teleprinter clerk. Lotte had joined for adventure, to escape the dullness of village life. She had loved the crisp uniform, the illusion of purpose. Now her eyes followed the American guards riding behind them, her hands gripping her knees. "They don't look like monsters," she whispered, voice quivering more from cold than fear. Greta nodded, unable to speak. Their destination was not a camp, at least not in the way they imagined. It was a muddy field behind a captured airstrip, fenced with barbed wire and watched by exhausted guards in olive drab. A translator with broken German announced that they would be processed and sent west. No one explained what that meant. The first night, hunger gnawed through the silence. Greta and Latte huddled together for warmth, trading crumbs of bread and scraps of hope. Some women wept until they were empty. Others stared blankly into the mist, whispering prayers to gods that had stopped listening. The guards smoked, laughed quietly among themselves, and otherwise ignored them. There were no beds, no stoves, no food, just the endless cold and the dull ache of waiting. Greta tried to sleep sitting upright, her back against the fence. She thought of her mother's kitchen, of the smell of baking bread, of how she had once believed that surrender meant safety. Now she understood. Surrender was only another word for uncertainty. By the end of the week, more prisoners arrived. Men this time, hollow-eyed and gaunt, shuffling through the slush like ghosts. The war was almost over, but for those who had lived it, ending didn't mean freedom. It only meant the beginning of something else. The long, painful process of learning how to be human again. The women were kept apart, fenced in by distance and exhaustion. Sometimes Greta caught fleeting glimpses, columns of defeated Wehrmacht soldiers, faces hollow, shoulders sagging beneath the weight of their own collapse. The Americans seemed barely able to contain it all. Trucks roared in and out, guards changed shifts with dull eyes, and food arrived irregularly. Thin gray soup one day, rock-hard biscuits the next, and sometimes nothing but the ache of hunger gnawing from within. The women learned quickly to beg quietly, a look or gesture when a guard passed too near. Some GIs tossed them scraps or shared a cigarette. Others stared past them, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to care. One evening, as dusk turned the sky to steel, a young American private stopped by the fence. He couldn't have been more than 19. His face was pale beneath a dusty helmet, his breath visible in the cold. For a moment he hesitated, then crouched and slid a tin cup of steaming liquid through the wire. "Soup," he said awkwardly, his accent clipped, uncertain. Greta blinked. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she took the cup, nodding in silence. Words failed her, her English was too small for gratitude. The warmth seeped into her hands, then her chest, thawing something she hadn't realized was frozen. When she looked up again, the boy was already walking away, his boots sinking into the mud. That moment, brief, human, unsettled her more than capture itself. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, monstrous, but this soldier looked like the boy she once danced with at a summer fair, before uniforms and sirens and fear. The world felt upside down. Latte, sitting beside her, whispered, "Be careful. Kindness can cost you." Greta didn't understand. Not yet. Not every encounter was kind. Another guard, broad-shouldered, too loud, his grin cutting like glass, tossed food scraps toward the women just to watch them scramble. His eyes lingered too long, and when one girl turned away, he spat near her boots. Power was its own kind of stench, unseen, heavy, always there. By the end of the week, the women were changed. The proud crispness of their uniforms was gone. Hair matted, faces hollow, insignia torn away. They spoke less and moved slower, learning to read the moods of their captors with wordless precision. Survival became a silent language, watching, waiting, blending into the gray. Some tried to vanish entirely. Others, braver or hungrier, sought favor with smiles, gestures, the offer of companionship. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. In this place, rules were fragile, and hunger was stronger than fear. Then came the rain. It swept across the camp in sheets, turning the earth into black sludge. Greta lay awake beneath a soaked blanket, her teeth clattering when headlights suddenly carved through the dark. A jeep screeched to a stop near the women's section. Two soldiers jumped out, one young, one older, wearing an officer's insignia. They spoke in English too fast to catch. Then the officer pointed. A guard strode into the crowd of women, lantern swinging. He scanned their faces as if choosing from a list only he could read. His gaze stopped on Greta. She froze. "Go," he said roughly, motioning toward the fence. Latte squeezed her hand once before letting go. Greta rose on trembling legs. Mud clung to her boots as she followed the guard through the gate. The officer studied her briefly, said something she couldn't understand, and gestured toward the jeep. She hesitated. His hand tightened around her arm, not cruel but final. The jeep roared to life, tearing down a bombed-out road lined with shattered houses. The night outside was a black ocean. Greta thought about escape, but the thought drowned before it reached the surface. They stopped at a farmhouse, its windows glowing faintly. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the scent of wood smoke and coffee. Maps covered the walls. An American flag hung crookedly behind a desk. The officer, tall, gray-eyed, his face marked by sleeplessness, turned to her and spoke slowly in careful German. "You will work? Typing? Telephone?" Greta nodded. He pointed at a chair and a battered typewriter beside a stove. Papers lay scattered across the desk. Reports, orders, words she couldn't read. "I'm Captain Miller," he said, tapping his chest. Then, with an almost weary gentleness, "Safe here. Stay." The words rippled through her like stones dropped in water. She sat. Her fingers trembled as they hovered above the keys. The stove hissed softly, filling the room with warmth. A mug of dark coffee appeared beside her hand. She didn't drink. Not yet. Greta watched him. His uniform, his holstered pistol, his weary eyes. He met her gaze briefly, then turned away, already buried in his reports. For the first time since surrender, she felt air fill her lungs again. But safety in 1945 was never simple. Behind every act of mercy lingered a question. What will it cost? Because here she was not free. She was useful. She would type. She would eat. She would live by the permission of the victors. Outside, the camp drowned in rain. Mud sucked at boots, blankets were soaked, and the smell of wet wool and despair clung to everything. Greta woke each morning stiff and cold, rising from the floor like someone twice her age. Across the wire, guards smoked beneath their ponchos, faces drawn but dry. Hunger became a living thing inside her. Soup came rarely, a watery broth with floating potato skins. Some days only a biscuit hard as stone. On others, nothing but the echo of an empty stomach and the dull ache of survival. Latte tried to keep a fragile sense of order among them. She divided scraps, coaxed the younger girls to talk, to laugh when they could. "If you stop talking," she told Greta one morning, lips cracked and pale, "you stop living." But even Latte's voice sometimes broke. One dawn, after a night of endless rain, she whispered, "I dreamed of bread, fresh white bread." I woke up crying. The Americans seemed crushed under the weight of their own victory. Every day, trains arrived with more prisoners. Mostly men, hollow-eyed and staggering. The guards grew harsher, rations thinner. Trucks loaded with supplies passed by without stopping. The Geneva Conventions existed only as ghosts. The U.S. Army had prepared for captives, yes, but not for millions surrendering at once. Logistics failed. People starved. Some died quietly, curled into the mud before sunrise. Greta saw her first corpse 3 days after the rain began. A young blonde man, clutching an empty tin bowl. No one touched him for hours until a guard finally dragged him away by the shoulders. No ceremony. No words, just disappearance. That sight hollowed her more than hunger ever could. Death was no longer a rumor. It was a neighbor. Inside the farmhouse, Greta's world was smaller but not safer. Captain Miller kept her working by the stove, typing endless reports, lists of captured weapons, requisitions, troop records. The warmth spared her skin. The food, coffee, tinned meat, sometimes even butter, saved her body. But salvation had a price. It always did. Miller was neither cruel nor kind. He spoke rarely, his voice quiet, his face lined with exhaustion. Sometimes he tried small words in German. Gut, Essen are beaten. Once, he asked softly, "Family?"
Greta answert, Mutter.
He nodded, said nothing more. Yet she caught him watching her sometimes, not with desire, but with something heavier. Recognition, perhaps. Two survivors staring at one another across the wreckage of a world. Latte was not so lucky. Latte remained among the others, Her skin stretched thin over bone, ghostly in the dim light. One night, Greta slipped her a crust of bread through the fence. Latte pressed it to her chest like treasure. "You're warm in there," she whispered, voice sharp with envy before softening into a tremor of gratitude. "Don't forget what it costs." Greta didn't answer. She didn't yet understand the price, but she could feel it growing, unseen. In the way guards' eyes lingered when she crossed the wire, in the hush that fell over Miller's staff whenever she entered. She was useful now, and usefulness in wartime was both armor and chain. Days blurred into weeks. Survival turned into a craft. The women bartered scraps of life. A cigarette for a crust, a translation for a sip of coffee. Some flirted with guards, gambling danger for favor. Others lowered their eyes and prayed to stay invisible. A few disappeared altogether, taken for questioning, for labor, or for reasons no one dared name. Rumors spoke of worse fates beyond the fence. Assault, slavery, revenge. Fear was constant, yet it hardened into resilience. Greta felt herself changing, her hunger sharpening her instincts, danger teaching her to read a man's tone before he spoke. Then one evening, a jeep screeched to a halt near the field. An American sergeant jumped out, shouting names from a wrinkled list. Greta froze when she heard Latte's. Her friend straightened, chin trembling but high. Greta ran to the fence. "Where are you taking her?" she shouted in halting English. The sergeant ignored her, motioning her back. Latte looked at Greta once. Just once, with fierce, wordless courage, then climbed into the jeep. The tail lights vanished into the rain. Greta never saw her again. That night, Greta sat by the farmhouse stove, staring at the typewriter. Her fingers were numb though the room was warm. When Miller entered, he carried a mug and paused, studying her face. "Your friend?" he asked quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. He hesitated, then said, "Not bad place. Work." His English faltered, his tone uncertain. He set the mug beside her. Hot broth, rich and fragrant, then left. The broth burned her tongue. Still, she drank, tears running silently. She hated him then, his calm power, his ability to decide fates with a word. Yet beneath that hatred stirred gratitude, or something like it, the desperate instinct to survive. War made contradictions of everyone. By mid-May, the camp was thinning. Trucks hauled prisoners west toward new camps in France or Germany. Greta stayed behind. Each departure tightened the invisible thread binding her to Miller's quiet world. She learned small details about him. He missed Iowa, once taught history, but never why he'd saved her. Protection? Loneliness? Pity? She couldn't tell. He never touched her, never threatened. Yet she knew. She lived only because he permitted it. When frost glittered on the grass one morning, Miller called her from the typewriter. "Today, camp moving," he said. "Many go. You stay. Work here. Safer." It wasn't an offer. It was a verdict. Greta stepped outside and watched the others climb into trucks. Faces hollow, eyes fixed on her. Some looked jealous, others accusing. She wanted to run after them, to refuse this false safety. But fear held her still. Safety was a cage she could not afford to abandon. When the last engine faded, silence settled. Only one guard remained, watching her with unreadable eyes. Greta's hands trembled as she returned indoors. Miller stood over a map, his voice barely a whisper. "War is almost over," he said. Then, after a pause, "But for you, not yet." The words hung in the air like frost. Outside, rain began again, soft, relentless. The war beyond the fence was ending. But inside this quiet captivity, something more dangerous was just beginning. Summer crept into the ruins, drying the mud to cracked earth, filling the air with the scent of dust and smoke. The guns were mostly silent. Newspapers declared peace. Cities far away celebrated. But peace to Greta felt like a rumor, a word spoken through glass. She was alive, fed, clothed, safe, but not free. Miller changed with the season. By June, the tension in him softened into fatigue. He stopped wearing his pistol indoors. His smiles, small, uncertain, appeared more often. Sometimes he talked without meaning to. About baseball, a sister in Chicago, the smell of cornfields after rain. Greta listened. Her English improved, but her silences said more. He never asked about her past, and she never offered. Silence was safer than truth. Still, silence couldn't hide the strange intimacy between them. She typed his reports, cleaned the stove, fetched maps. He left small gifts, a slice of bread, an apple. At first, she blushed with gratitude. Later, she accepted them wearily, understanding the balance between them. He commanded. She endured. But beneath that imbalance flickered something nameless. A fragile, human connection neither could admit. Greta feared it. Hatred was simple. This was not. One evening, he invited her to sit, not to work. The setting sun turned the room bronze. He poured coffee, added real sugar, and slid the cup toward her. "You safe here?" he asked quietly. "Safer than outside," she answered. He nodded, eyes lowered. "War makes strange friends," he murmured. Greta thought of Latte, of the vanished faces beyond the fence, of those who once shouted orders and now begged for crumbs. Strange friends indeed. Rumors spread. Other camps closing, prisoners released or lost to the march home. But time stood still here. Some guards left. Others arrived, loud and restless. One, a lanky corporal named Harris, noticed Greta almost immediately. His German was clumsy, his grin too wide. He joked, offered cigarettes. Miller said nothing, only watched. That evening, when Harris lingered too long by her desk, Miller's voice sliced through the humid air, sharp as broken glass. "That's enough." Harris froze, hands raised in mock surrender, a laugh curling on his lips. But Miller didn't laugh. The look he gave could have stripped paint from the walls. The message was clear. From that moment on, Greta understood. She was under Miller's protection, and protection was its own quiet form of possession. Kept Harris at bay, kept other men wary. Yet it also locked her inside invisible walls she couldn't escape. The kindness was real. So was the cage. Both could exist at once. She often wondered what he wanted from her. He never touched her, never forced words or favors. But his eyes lingered too long, and his small offerings, bread, sugar, safety itself, carried an unspoken weight. Perhaps it wasn't desire in the ordinary sense. Perhaps it was loneliness, or a desperate need to hold meaning in the wreckage of a ruined world. But whatever it was, it bound her. So Greta adapted. There was no other choice. She smiled when he brought coffee, kept her posture careful, respectful, never defiant. She thanked him softly, always in careful English. She learned to live between gratitude and survival, to accept what she must without opening the door to more. Each day was a balancing act, a tightrope over emptiness. One wrong step, one look too sharp, one word too proud, and her fragile sanctuary could crumble. Outside, Germany bled quietly under occupation. Villages smoldered from retreating troops or revenge raids. The Soviets were advancing from the east, their reputation a whisper of terror that spread faster than fire. Refugees trudged westward in endless lines, eyes hollow, stories darker than night, of looting, assault, and revenge. Even the Americans, the supposed bringers of order, were not untouched by chaos. There were stories, soldiers trading food for favors, desperation twisting into exploitation. Greta listened to it all like someone running her fingers along a blade, aware that her life hung on its edge. Miller's silence, once unsettling, now felt like armor. Yet it was armor that frightened her almost as much as what lay beyond it. The moment everything crystallized came late one blistering afternoon. Greta was typing, sweat sticking the paper to her hands, while Miller spoke with two visiting officers, strangers, loud with easy victory. One of them noticed her, smirked, and said something in English that made the other roar with laughter. Miller's shoulders stiffened. His reply came out clipped, sharp. The laughter faltered, but one officer pushed further, leaning forward with a grin too knowing, reaching a hand toward her. In an instant, Miller was on his feet. "Not yours." The words landed like a shot. The room fell silent. The officer's grin curdled. For a moment, no one moved. Then he muttered something under his breath, turned away, and the conversation limped back to dull logistics. Greta's fingers shook on the keys. She didn't look up, but she felt the shift, the invisible claim tightening like a collar, protection woven with ownership, safety laced with control. That night, Miller didn't speak. He sat with a glass in his hand, staring at nothing. Greta stayed by the stove, watching the shadows crawl along the floorboards, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. In the end, she did neither. The silence between them said enough. When she finally lay on her cot, sleep refused her. She stared at the ceiling beams, tracing in her mind the cost of every bargain the war demanded. Latte's vanishing face, Harris's grin, Miller's low growl, "Not yours." Each choice bent around survival, dignity traded piece by piece for the illusion of control. Outside, the crickets sang, fragile voices trying to fill a world too quiet after so much death. Inside, Greta understood something terrible and certain, that her safety existed only as long as Miller chose to protect it, and that his choice was its own prison. The next morning, Miller greeted her as if nothing had changed. Calm, polite, distant. Yet when she sat at the typewriter, she could feel his presence behind her. Heavy, watchful, unspoken. The war on paper was over, but the battle for ownership of her life had only begun. When the trucks finally came for the last prisoners, the air smelled of warm dust and diesel. It was August. The sky stretched thin and hard, a cruel blue over a broken land. Greta stood beside the farmhouse, clutching her old satchel, once heavy, now almost weightless. The barbed wire was gone. The field where she had once stood shivering in mud was only empty earth. Victory had turned into paperwork. The U.S. Army was sorting through the living, deciding who went west, who stayed, who mattered. Miller walked beside her, hands in his pockets, slower than before. His face was older now, softened by exhaustion. "Transport west," he said quietly in rough German. "You go now. Camp closed." He searched her face, perhaps for relief or forgiveness or something he couldn't name. Greta felt none of it clearly, only a strange lightness, like a bird too long in a cage suddenly flung into open air. She wanted to ask why he had kept her, why he had protected her, claimed her, but never crossed the line others would have. Was it duty? Loneliness? Guilt? She would never know. Some questions were too dangerous to speak aloud, so she only nodded. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you." The words carried something else, buried deep and wordless. Miller's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, he looked as though he might answer. Then his expression shuddered. The soldier returned, replacing the man. "Safe now," he murmured. It sounded less like a promise than a hope. The road west was long, rough, and full of ghosts. Greta rode with other women, some from camps, others from ruined towns. All were thin, silent, worn down to bone and memory. They spoke in fragments. Nights of hunger, sudden mercy, trades made in desperation. Latte's name slipped from Greta's lips once, and vanished into silence. The landscape was rubble and ash, scorched farms, shattered cities. Civilians stared blankly as the trucks rumbled past. Germany wasn't a country anymore. It was a wound. At a processing station near the Rhine, the women were herded into tents. Interrogations followed. Names, units, work. Greta told the truth where she could, and silence where she must. The officer barely looked at her, already weary of war's debris. A stamp, a paper, a ration packet, and she was free. Free. Her village was half rubble when she returned. Her mother, impossibly alive, wept into her shoulder and asked nothing. The neighbors watched but did not speak. In post-war Germany, silence was survival. Greta learned to bury her story. She said she had worked in communications, that she had been caught in retreat. She never spoke of barbed wire, of hunger, of the farmhouse or the man who had both saved and caged her. But his shadow lingered. Sometimes, in the dead of night, She dreamed of the typewriter's clatter, the smell of coffee, the sound of Miller's voice. Not yours. Some mornings she woke in gratitude. Others, in fury so fierce it stole her breath. He had saved her, yes, but on his terms. Years passed. The country rebuilt, concrete over memory. Greta married a gentle man who knew nothing beyond his own wartime hunger. She bore children, smiled at parades, learned to live as if peace had always been. But she never forgot that safety could be a kind of captivity, and that kindness, when mixed with power, could bruise as deeply as cruelty. Decades later, when historians began asking about women in Hitler's war, when reporters unearthed diaries and testimonies, Greta stayed silent. She burned the one letter she had written to Miller but never sent. She didn't want pity. She didn't want judgment. She only wanted to own her story, quietly, privately, at last. Still, some nights she saw again the day she left the farmhouse. The sun had been brutal, the air humming with heat. Miller stood with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing as the truck rumbled to life. Their eyes met, just once, and in that look lived everything words could never hold. Need, guilt, power, pity, something almost like love, and nothing at all like freedom. Then the truck lurched forward, and the moment disappeared into dust. Greta never saw him again. She never learned whether he went home whole or broken, whether he remembered her. But she carried him and what he represented in the quiet chambers of her mind. Because she had learned the most haunting truth of all. Wars do not end cleanly. The war had not yet ended, but everyone could feel it dying. By February 1945, the heart of Germany no longer beat. It merely shuddered. Towns were silent except for the creak of wagons, the crunch of boots on frozen roads, and the distant drone of engines high above the clouds. Smoke still rose from what had once been cities. In the east, the Red Army was already across the Oder. In the west, the Americans and British were sweeping toward the Rhine. Between them stretched a nation that had forgotten what peace sounded like. In a small village outside Erfurt, the war's end arrived not with soldiers but with emptiness. The men had gone years before, to Russia, to France, to graves no one would visit. The ones who returned were shadows of themselves, limping, coughing, staring at the ground when someone spoke. Women ran the farms now. Old men sharpened scythes that would never see a harvest. Children learned not to ask questions. Inside a half-collapsed barn, Anna Keller stacked damp wood beside a stove that no longer drew properly. She was 26 and had not seen her husband since Stalingrad. His last letter came in the winter of '42, a few lines of optimism written before the encirclement. She still kept it in her apron pocket, though the paper had turned soft from handling. The barn smelled of wet hay and soot. The wind slipped through broken planks and carried with it the distant rumble of artillery. Faint, but enough to make the chickens restless. Anna paused, rubbing her cold hands together. She could not tell if the sound came from east or west anymore. It didn't matter. Every direction meant danger. The local mayor, a tired man with a limp, had ordered everyone to stay put. "The army will hold," he said, though his voice betrayed disbelief. "The Führer has new weapons." The villagers nodded because it was safer to nod. But everyone knew the truth. The army was gone, the weapons were myths, and the Führer was just a voice on the radio, shouting into ruins. Each morning, Anna walked to the edge of the village with a pail to fetch water from a half-frozen stream. Around her, the fields were scarred with shell craters and burned wagons. The snow had turned gray from ash. Sometimes she found a helmet sticking out of the drift, sometimes with a skull still inside. She no longer flinched. The world had become numb. Hunger dulled fear. Cold erased grief. People spoke softly, if at all, as if words themselves might summon bombs. One afternoon, while Anna gathered sticks near the old church, she heard boots crunching behind her. Turning, she saw two boys in Luftwaffe uniforms. Barely 17, rifles slung across their thin shoulders. Their cheeks were hollow, and frost clung to their eyelashes. They looked lost. "Is this Dorf Eisen?" one asked, breath steaming in the cold. "It was," Anna said. They exchanged glances. We were told to report to the local command. Is there one? She shook her head. Not anymore. They left 2 days ago. Left? The boy repeated. Where? She hesitated. West. Or east. I don't know. They burned their papers and went. The boys stood silently for a moment. Then one kicked at the snow. We'll wait here, he muttered, as if saying it would make it true. Anna watched them go to the church steps and sit down, huddling together for warmth. They looked like children wearing uniforms that didn't fit. She thought about offering them food but had nothing left to share. That night, the sound of gunfire came closer. Short bursts, then silence. Somewhere, a dog barked until it didn't. At dawn, the first American jeep rolled into the village. A white star painted on the hood. The soldiers wore thick coats and carried rifles that looked heavy but well cared for. They didn't shoot. They didn't need to. The war had already been drained out of everyone there. Anna stood by the doorway of her cottage as they passed. One soldier, seeing her watching, raised a hand. Not in threat, but in greeting. She didn't move. He smiled faintly, a human gesture in a place that had forgotten humanity, then walked on. Behind them came trucks, endless trucks, filled with men, supplies, cigarettes. They stopped in the square, and within an hour, the Americans had set up a field kitchen and a command tent. The villagers gathered cautiously, drawn by the smell of real food. The soldiers handed out tins of soup and pieces of chocolate, laughing as children stared at them like creatures from another world. That night, for the first time in months, the village was not silent. Engines hummed. Radios crackled in English. Laughter drifted through the cold air. The war, it seemed, had ended here, quietly, without ceremony. Yet for the Germans, peace did not feel like liberation. It felt like emptiness wearing a new uniform. In the days that followed, the Americans set about cataloging everything: houses, barns, even livestock. They asked for names, dates of birth, professions. Each villager became a number in a ledger. Anna signed her name with shaking fingers. A young lieutenant, barely older than the dead Luftwaffe boys, asked if there were any Nazis in the area. She wanted to laugh. Everyone had been a Nazi once. It had been the price of bread, the way to keep your home, your husband, your job. Now it was a crime. So she said nothing. The 2 Luftwaffe boys were found in the church basement, trying to hide. They were disarmed, searched, and sent away on a truck. No one saw them again. The Americans were polite, mostly. Some were kind. Others stared too long or barked orders with practiced impatience. They searched houses for weapons and valuables. They took watches, sometimes coats. But they shared food, too, and their medics treated the sick. War, Anna thought, had blurred the lines between mercy and cruelty until they looked the same. One afternoon, she helped bury an old man who had frozen to death in his barn. The Americans allowed it but made sure to photograph the body first. For records. The camera clicked over and over, each flash turning grief into evidence. By April, refugees began to appear from the east, endless columns of them. Women pushing carts, old men on crutches, children dragging suitcases. They came from Silesia, from Königsberg, from cities whose names were already being erased. The Russians were behind them, and no one wanted to be caught when they arrived. The Americans turned many away, but still they came. The village filled with strangers. Disease followed: lice, fever, coughing that never stopped. Anna opened her door to a mother and her 2 children one night, sharing her last loaf of bread. The next morning, the younger child was dead. The mother wept silently and asked for a shovel. They buried the boy in the orchard, beneath a tree that would never bloom again. As May approached, word spread that the Führer was dead. Shot himself in Berlin. No one believed it at first, then everyone did. The radio stations went silent. The propaganda posters began to peel from the walls. The Reich had vanished like a bad dream, leaving only its ruins behind. Some people cried. Others said nothing. Most simply went back to finding food. One evening, Anna walked to the stream and saw her reflection in the water. She looked older than her mother had at 40. Her hands were raw, her face thin, her eyes dull. She realized she hadn't spoken a full sentence in days. There was nothing left to say. The Americans announced that all radios must be surrendered. Books with swastikas were burned in the square, the same square where, only 2 years ago, people had cheered speeches about victory. Now they watched silently as the pages turned to ash. A rumor spread that the Russians would soon take control of this zone. The Americans, it was said, were preparing to withdraw. Panic returned. Some villagers packed and fled west, hoping to reach Bavaria before the lines shifted. Others stayed, too tired to move again. Anna stayed. There was nowhere else to go. When the Americans finally left, the village fell silent once more. Days passed without a single vehicle on the road. Then, one gray morning, trucks with red stars on their doors arrived. The new soldiers didn't smile. They didn't offer chocolate. They spoke a language no one understood and carried bayonets that gleamed even in the weak light. The war, it seemed, had ended only for some. Anna was ordered to report to the square again. The Russians took everything the Americans had left untouched: watches, rings, chickens. They called it reparations. When they were done, they rounded up the remaining men for labor. Some women too. Anna's name was on the list. She packed what little she had: a coat, her husband's letter, a small piece of bread, and climbed into the back of a truck. The road stretched west, then north. Fields blurred into forests, villages into ruins. No one spoke. The wind cut through the boards of the truck and filled the air with dust. Anna closed her eyes and thought of her husband. Not as he had died, but as he had once been, standing in a field of sunflowers the summer before the war. She tried to hold that image in her mind as long as she could. But memory, like everything else in Germany, was fading. The months after the war settled like dust over shattered Germany. Greta returned to her village, the satchel she had carried since surrender now empty but heavy with memory. The fields around her home were scarred, barns reduced to splintered skeletons, roads pocked with craters that had long since filled with mud and weeds. Yet life persisted in the oddest, smallest ways. A child chasing a dog across rubble, a neighbor dragging a cart of potatoes, a train rumbling faintly in the distance. It was a life built on quiet endurance, and Greta felt herself a stranger within it. Her mother survived, though the years of deprivation had etched deep lines into her face. She did not ask where Greta had been, nor did she inquire about the uniformed months, the surrender, the camp. Silence had become the language of survival in post-war Germany, and both understood it well. Greta slipped back into domestic rhythms. Fetching water from the well, sweeping the kitchen, kneading dough. Yet, in the quiet hours, the farmhouse air carried echoes that could not be washed away. The clatter of the typewriter, the scent of coffee and damp wood, the shadowed figure of Miller. These lingered, vivid and unbidden. Letters were scarce. News of the outside world arrived piecemeal. Allied occupation persisted, and with it came bureaucratic lists, rationing, and the slow grind of reconstruction. Greta learned to navigate the delicate balance between being seen and remaining invisible. Former acquaintances regarded her with a quiet suspicion, knowing only that she had been in uniform, that she had returned. Some avoided her gaze. Others whispered behind her back. She had been a soldier, however briefly, and now bore a stigma the village could not quite name. Yet life demanded movement. She began work at a small communications office in the nearby town, the remnants of pre-war infrastructure barely functioning. Telephones, wires, and scribbled logs were all she had, yet they offered a thread of purpose. Her fingers remembered the rhythm of the typewriter. The reports she had once drafted for Miller now found echoes in civilian dispatches. Each message sent, each wire strung, was an affirmation that she existed in a world that might otherwise forget her. But the shadow of the farmhouse lingered. She could not forget Miller, the strange claim of safety he had imposed, the silent lesson that kindness could be both a shield and a chain. As summer ripened, letters arrived from the West. Displaced persons seeking family, reports of former prisoners now free, notices of trials and tribunals. Greta read them with a detached curiosity. She recognized the patterns: hunger, fear, bargains for survival. Yet the distance from them offered a fragile relief. In her dreams, however, the memories returned. The mud, the rain, the glare of floodlights, and the impossible calculus of which favors could save a life. Sometimes she woke clutching the thin blanket of her bed, sweat cold against her skin, imagining the hand of a guard, the quiet assertion of Miller's presence behind her. One morning, months after her return, a letter arrived from an unexpected source. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, foreign in its rhythm yet unmistakably familiar. Greta's fingers trembled as she opened it. The words inside were few, the meaning more than explicit. Safe now, M. No further explanation, no apology, no request. Just a reminder, a ghost of the farmhouse, a thread connecting past to present. Greta folded the note, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. She carried it with her like a talisman, yet it reminded her that safety had always been conditional, never owed, and never permanent. Life pressed onward. Greta learned to cultivate small joys, the taste of fresh bread, the laughter of neighbors' children, the rhythm of summer work in the fields. Yet each step forward was measured against the invisible weight of what had come before. She could eat, sleep, and move freely, but the memory of those months in captivity, under Miller's watchful authority, shaped her every decision. The unspoken bargains, the subtle rules of existence in a world where power and kindness intertwined, remained a compass she could not discard. By the end of the first post-war year, Greta had begun corresponding with a few women she had known in the camp. Their letters were tentative, each word carefully chosen to convey survival without inviting pity or judgment. Through them, she learned of others' fates. Some had married, some struggled to return to work, others carried scars unseen yet permanent. The letters were a mirror, reflecting the universality of their experience. The negotiation of safety, the unacknowledged debts to those who had offered protection, the quiet assertion of agency where chaos once reigned. Greta's life, however, remained bound to the memory of the farmhouse and the man who had shaped a brief, precarious sanctuary within it. She never sought Miller, never asked the questions that might have shattered her fragile peace. The war had taught her that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Instead, she carried the knowledge silently, a private ledger of debt and gratitude, fear and relief, survival and ownership. As the years passed, Germany rebuilt. Cities rose from rubble, roads were patched, trains ran again. Greta married a man whose hunger had once mirrored her own, but whose innocence of war offered her a tentative normalcy. She bore children, attended school events, and learned to smile without the constant calculation of survival. Yet in quiet moments, the past returned. She could hear the typewriter's keys, smell the damp wood of the farmhouse, and feel the weight of Miller's claim, silent yet absolute. Decades later, historians would probe the archives of the war, seeking to document women's experiences in uniform. Greta, now aged and careful, remembered the letters she had burned, the stories she had never told. She understood that ownership, protection, and survival had formed a lattice impossible to unravel fully. Her life, though outwardly ordinary, bore the invisible marks of a negotiation conducted in mud, rain, and the faint glow of a stove. It was a life she claimed as her own, yet one eternally tethered to the unspoken currents of power and kindness that had defined her survival. In the quiet of her home, when the world slept and children's laughter faded to memory, Greta sometimes traced the outline of the satchel she had carried so long ago. She remembered the farmhouse, the warmth, the bread, and the eyes of the man who had defined her fate. And she understood, with a clarity that only comes from years of reflection, that war had ended in geography, in headlines, in treaties, but for her, its consequences had stretched far beyond, shaping not just survival, but the subtle architecture of the human soul. Years passed like a river carving its quiet path through stone. Greta lived, breathed, and endured, yet the invisible contours of her past remained as sharp as ever. She became a mother, a wife, a member of a recovering community, yet the memories of the farmhouse and the man who had held the line between safety and ownership lingered like shadows at the edge of vision. even in moments of laughter with her children, when the smell of fresh bread or the sound of a distant train called forth ordinary domestic pleasure. She felt the faint pull of another life, one measured in mud, rain, and careful obedience. Her husband, kind and practical, knew nothing of the farmhouse, of the weeks spent balancing on the fragile thread between survival and submission. Greta never told him. Silence was safer, and the world outside had taught her that some truths were too dangerous to speak, too fragile to risk. Yet in quiet nights, she would sometimes wake, heart hammering, remembering the echo of a typewriter, the quiet gaze of Miller, and the sharp, unspoken command, "Not yours." School holidays, market days, and the small festivals of the village carried her outward, but her mind often drifted back into that strange, liminal space of war's end. Letters, now brittle and yellowed, sat in a locked drawer, remnants of correspondence with other women who had survived the camps, fragments of shared experience, warnings and affirmations of existence. They reminded her that survival had never been a simple matter of life or death, but a delicate negotiation of power, kindness, and submission. Greta sometimes imagined the other women from the camp. Latte's vanished face, the echo of her desperate glance across the jeep's tail lights, faces she had never seen again, swallowed by fate or the shifting tides of human chaos. She wrote their names in a private ledger of memory, whispered them into the quiet corners of her home, preserving fragments of the past that no official history could ever capture. These memories, heavy and unyielding, became a private geography of the soul, marking spaces no one else could traverse. Time did not erase Miller from her mind. She never received another letter, never knew if he had returned to Iowa, if he had survived the years unbroken or fractured. Sometimes she imagined his life, solitary and disciplined, haunted by the same invisible debts, the same ghost of control and protection. She recognized, in herself and in him, the strange companionship forged in extremity. Two people bound by the arbitrary lines of war, by survival and by unspoken claims, a connection too subtle for understanding, too real to forget. Decades later, when historians began to probe the experiences of women who had served, who had been captured, who had walked the fragile lines of survival, Greta read articles and listened to interviews, feeling both recognition and alienation. They spoke of courage, of duty, of liberation. They rarely spoke of the quiet bargains, the unspoken debts, the subtle balances of power that determined whether a life was preserved or lost. Greta understood that her story, like so many others, could not be contained in papers, reports, or academic theses. It existed only in memory, in the trembling acknowledgement that safety often came at a cost measured in obedience, silence, and the faintest hint of coercion disguised as protection. She had learned, over the years, to carry the duality without letting it dominate her every thought. Love and fear, gratitude and resentment, safety and captivity. These threads wove through her life, invisible yet undeniable. She gave what she could to her children: warmth, laughter, routine, the certainty that the world could still hold beauty. But she also gave them lessons unspoken, lessons embedded in caution, in understanding the weight of unearned power, in knowing when to trust and when to remain invisible. On quiet nights, Greta sometimes returned in her mind to the farmhouse, to the smell of coffee and damp wood, to the soft glow of the stove that had been her sanctuary and her cage. She remembered the small gifts, the sugar, the bread, the warmth, not as generosity alone, but as gestures tied irrevocably to survival, as instruments of claim, as markers of the strange friendship war had forced into being. And she understood, with clarity grown over decades, that these were the lessons that had outlasted hunger, mud, and fear. That kindness could be as binding as cruelty, that protection could be ownership, and that the human soul often navigates the thinnest of lines between freedom and surrender. Greta never returned to the places of her captivity. The villages, the fields, the charred ruins, all were gone or transformed, replaced by new roads, new homes, new lives. Yet in the quietest hours, when dusk fell across her garden and the air smelled faintly of earth and rain, she felt the echo of that old, sharp lesson. She understood, finally, that the war had ended in politics, treaties, and headlines, but in the interior lives of those who had survived, it had never truly ended. It had left a map of human resilience and fragility, a geography of the heart shaped by necessity, fear, and the unspoken bargains between strangers. And Greta, living among the ordinary, carrying the extraordinary within, knew she had survived not just by strength or courage, but by reading the currents of power, by honoring the invisible claims of others, by embracing a strange, conditional safety, and by ultimately learning that survival itself is a story without simple endings. In that knowledge lay her quiet, unshakable freedom. It was not the freedom of open fields or victory parades. It was a freedom born of understanding, of memory, of mastery over what could not be changed. It was hers alone, and no one, not even the ghost of Miller or the memories of hunger and fear, could ever take it away.